Hello, everyone. My name is Ian Murphy. I'm going to go ahead and do an audio recording reading of Ariel Toaf's Blood Passover. I'm pretty sure my version's an abridged copy because the name is different on here. The Bloody Satanic Sacrifice Rituals of the Jewish Race. And the reason why I know that is because if you actually read it, at least the first couple pages, it actually tells you that they stuck with the name Blood Passover, which is in contradiction to that. So I'm pretty sure that's only for marketing purposes for somebody else. We're gonna just go right into it, I guess. Bloody Satanic Sacrifice Rituals of the Jewish Race. This is a book that belongs to the ages and to hell with the ADL. We like our revenge served cold. And unfortunately, the table of contents doesn't actually have any names, so I'm going to go ahead as I'm reading this. You'll see um, a name that I'll just give it for chapter 1, chapter 2, and all that. Forward by original translators. The following translation was performed free of charge to protest an injustice, the destruction by the ADL of Ariel Toaf's blood Passover on Jewish ritual murders they committed. The author is the son of the chief rabbi of Rome and a professor of Jewish Renaissance and medieval history at Bar Ilan University in Israel, just outside of Tel Aviv. Dr. Toaf is uniquely qualified to write this book, being thoroughly familiar with the derivative literature in English, French, German, and Italian, as well as the original documentary sources in Latin, medieval Italian, Hebrew, and Yiddish. This is not something he worked on in secret. On the contrary, he worked on it openly with his university students and colleagues in Israel for several years. One of his students was even going to publish a paper on the subject. The author is extremely careful about what he says, and his conclusions must be taken seriously. It reads like a detective story. If it had been published in Israel in Hebrew, no one would have cared. There are large bodies of literature in Hebrew that Jews do not wish Gentiles to know about. But Dr. Toaf announced, uh, but Dr. Toaf's announcement of its publication in Italy in Italian raised a worldwide firestorm of fury. Under unbearable pressure, the book was withdrawn from publication. On the names: Candia, Venetian Crete, Serenisima, I'm going to botch the names here, the city of Venice, Veneto, region northeast of Venice, Mestre, closest mainland city to Venice, Podesta, magistrate, Ratisbona, Regensburg, Germany, Salamancio, Simonicio, Sim, Simonicio, Demetuvix of Solomon, Simon Avogaria de Common, similar to District Prosecutor's Office. We have semi-Italianized the names of certain German Jews living in Italy. This is to distinguish them from Germans living in Germany. On the translation, Professor Toaf writes with a very large vocabulary, using many words from the Venetiano and Veneto dialects. His sources include not only the modern derivative literature in English, French, Italian, French, and German, but the original documentation in Hebrew, Yiddish, Latin, medieval Italian, sometimes 8,000 years old. He does not translate or italicize the medieval Latin or Italian in his footnotes. These are sometimes in a mixture of languages as well. In most cases, the material contained in the footnotes is simply paraphrased in the text. Where we have attempted to translate this material, it appears in square brackets. All translators' notes are in square brackets. On the text, Professor Toaf has since partially recanted and now maintains that yes, Jews are a corrupting and disruptive element in society. Yes, Jews lend money at 40% and seem to do little else. Yes, Jews buy and sell justice with huge bribes. Yes, Jews pull off all sorts of fraudulent bankruptcies and swindles. Yes, Jews resort to poisoning and assassination when thwarted. Yes, Jews are obsessed with hatred for Christians and the Christian religion. Yes, Jews kidnapped and castrated Christian boys on a large scale and sold them into slavery in Islamic Spain for centuries. Yes, Jews used and still use human blood in all sorts of quack remedies despite the biblical prohibition, even for minor complaints. Yes, Jews used and still use Christian human blood in their matzo balls at Passover. Yes, Jews used and still use Christian human blood in their wine at Passover. Yes, the blood had to be from Christian boys no more than 7 years of age. Yes, the blood has to be certified kosher by a rabbi. Yes, there was and is a large and profitable trade in fake blood products and animal blood, which are unsuitable to the purpose. Yes, Christians tried to sell the blood of Christian boys to Jews, but were rejected because the Jews feared it was animal blood. But no Christian boys were ever killed to obtain the blood. Never, never, or hardly ever. It all came from voluntary donors. Anybody having read the book will simply laugh. The only saving clause is that these charges are made against Ashkenazi Jews only. It would be interesting to see how much filthy Sephardic linen the Ashkenazis could air in public if they so choose. On the title, it makes little practical difference, but we feel that the title Blood Passover is preferable to Bloody Passover for several reasons. The title is, after all, Pasque de Sangue, not Pasque Sanguinos. Uh, let's see. A recipient de sangue would be blood receptacle, something intrinsically intended to receive, and a hold blood recipient inextricably bound up with blood by its very nature, by design, as its essence, like those tubes they use when you have a blood test. There is a clear identification between the two nouns A equals B. A recipient sanguinoso, a bloody receptacle, would be simply a recipient of any nature whatever, which had merely become soiled or smeared with blood for some reason, the blood being something fortuitous, accidental, and foreign to its essential nature. For example, if someone hit you in the mouth with an ashtray, wash the blood off, and it is no longer a bloody receptacle. We believe that it was Professor Toev's intention to coin a phrase like bloody or blood money. It is obvious that blood money implies far more than simply bloody money. It is something specific, something very distinct, a very narrow meaning. On the Latin, it is obvious that this is not correct classic Latin, nor is it standard medieval Latin as written by someone trained in literature. This is the ugly jargon of Venetian notaries cram-packed with Italian and Venetian words, and seds, aforementions, above mentioned, aforesades, and all the rest of it. In Venetian, ordinary words which appear to be the same as Italian often have radically different meanings. We believe that this may be reflected in some of the Latin given here. This would account for some of the astonishing translation errors into Latin. It is obvious that medieval Latin had evolved to such an extent as to become, for all practical purposes, an entirely different language in certain regions and among certain classes of people, almost like Venetian itself. We have done our best with this material, but to do it justice would require a level of erudition on a level with Professor Toop's own. If you show it to your Latin teacher, he will simply tell you that it is not correct and will either fail to understand it easily or will mistranslate it very badly unless he has the full context. Professor Toff is that great rarity in the modern world, a sincere and disinterested lover of truth. It is obvious that he loves all this detail for its own sake, although at times it is hard to tell where he is headed with some of it. It is to Professor Toeps himself that the present humble and inadequate, but entirely disinterested effort is sincerely dedicated. Indeed, we look forward to reading some of Professor Toep's other books. We feel that Blood Passover is a masterpiece of literature and a masterpiece of history, which deserves to be widely read, not flushed down the memory hole in some sort of international ADL police state. Preface. Ritual, ritual homicide trials are a difficult knot to unravel. Most researchers simply set out in search of more or less convincing confirmation of previously developed theories of which the researcher himself appears firmly convinced. The significance of any information failing to fit the preconceived picture is often minimized and sometimes passed over entirely in silence. Oddly, in this type of research, that which is to be proven is simply taken for granted to begin with. There is a clear perception that any other attitude would involve hazards and repercussions which are to be avoided at all costs. There is no doubt that the uniformity of the defendant's confessions, contradicted only by variance and incongruities generally relating to details of secondary importance, was assumed by the judges and so-called public opinion to constitute proof that the Jews, characterized by their great mobility and widespread dispersion, practiced horrible murderous rituals in hatred of the Christian religion. The stereotype of ritual murder, like that of prof- profanation of the host and cannibal sacrifice, was present in their minds from the outset, suggesting to both judges and inquisitors alike the possibility of extorting symmetrical, harmonious, and significant confessions, triggering a chain reaction of denunciations, veritable and proper manhunts, and indiscriminate massacres. While attempts have been made in certain cases to reconstruct the ideological mechanisms and underlying theological and mythological beliefs with their theological and mythological justifications, which rendered the persecution of the Jews possible at the practitioners of outrageous and bloodthirsty rituals, particularly in the German-speaking countries of Europe, little or nothing has been done to investigate the beliefs of the men and women accused, or who accused themselves of ritual crucifixion, desecration of the host, hematophagy, which is eating of blood products, and cannibalism. On the other hand, if an exception to be made for the first sensational case of ritual crucifixion, which occurred in Norwich, England in 1146, or the equally well-known blood libel case at Trent, Italy in 1475, the trial records and transcripts, usually referred to under the generic term historical documentation, constitute in actual fact very poor and often purely circumstantial evidence, highly condensed in form and very sparse in detail, totally insufficient for research purposes. Perhaps for this very same reason, that which is missing is often artificially added, assumed, or formulated as hypothesis in the absence of any explicit probative evidence one way or another, i.e., in the desired direction. In the meantime, the entire matter is immersed in a tinted bath in which the emerging image is superficial at best, enveloped in a cloud of mystery, with all the related paraphernalia from a distant past, and must remain forever incomprehensible to researchers intent on examining these problems through the application of anachronistic interpretive categories. These efforts, obviously unreliable, are generally performed in good faith, or more exactly, almost always in good faith. Thus, in Anglo Saxon, British, and American historical anthropological research on Jews and ritual murder, from Joshua Trachtenberg to Roni Po Chia Hisai, magic and witchcraft traditionally uh, magic and witchcraft traditionally feature among the favored aspects under examination. This approach, for a variety of reasons, is enjoying an extraordinary rebirth at the present time, but that which seems to obtain a high degree of popularity at the moment is not necessarily convincing to meticulous scholars, not content with superficial and impressionistic responses. Nearly all the studies on Jews and the so called blood libel accusations to date have concentrated almost exclusively on persecutions and persecutors, on the ideologies and presumed motives of those same persecutors, their hatred of Jews, their political and or religious cynicism, their xenophobic and racist rancor, their contempt for minorities. Little or no attention has been paid to the attitudes of the persecuted Jews themselves and their underlying patterns of ideological behavior, even when they confess themselves guilty of the specific accusations brought against them. Even less attention has been paid to the behavioral patterns and attitudes of these same Jews, nor have these matters been considered worthy even of interested attention or serious investigation. On the contrary, these behavioral patterns and attitudes have simply been incontrovertibly dismissed as non existent, as invented out of whole cloth by sick minds of anti Semites and fanatical, obtusely dogmatic Christians. Nevertheless, although difficult to digest, these actions, once their authenticity is demonstrated or even supposed or as possible, should be the object of serious study by reputable scholars. The condemnation, or alternatively the aberrant justification of these rituals, cannot be imposed upon researchers as the sole and banal options. Scholars must be permitted the possibility of attempting serious research on the actual or presumed religious, theological, and historical motivations of the Jewish protagonists themselves. Blind excuses are just as worthless as blindly dogmatic condemnation. Neither can demonstrate anything other than that which already exists in the mind of the observer to begin with. It is precisely the possibility of evading any clear, precise, and unambiguous definition of the reality of ritual child murders rooted in religious faith which has facilitated the intentional or involuntary blindness of Christian and Jewish scholars alike, both pro and anti-Jewish. Any additional example of the two-dimensional flattening of Jewish history, viewed exclusively as the history of religious or political anti-Semitism at all times, must necessarily be regretted, when one-way questions presuppose one-way answers. When the stereotype of anti-Semitism hovers menacingly over any objective approach to the difficult problem of historical research in relation to Jews, any research ends up by losing a large part of its value. All such research is thus transformed by the very nature of things into a guided tour conducted against a fictitious and unreal background in a virtual reality show, intended to produce the desired reaction which has naturally been decided upon in advance. As stressed above, it is simply not permissible to ignore the mental attitudes of the Jews who were tried, tortured, and executed for ritual murder, or persecuted on the same charge. At some point, we must ask ourselves whether the confessions of the defendants constitute exact records of actual events or merely the reflection of beliefs forming part of the symbolic, mythical, and magical context which must be reconstructed to be understood. In other words, do these confessions reflect merely the beliefs of Gentile judges, clergy, and populace with their private phobias and obsessions, or, on the contrary, of the defendants themselves. Untangling the knot is not an easy or pleasant task, but perhaps it is not entirely impossible. In the first place, therefore, we must investigate the mental attitudes of the Jews themselves in the tragic drama of ritual sacrifice, together with the accompanying religious beliefs and superstitious and magical elements. Due attention must be paid to the admissions which made historical and local context identifiable within a succession of German-speaking territories on both sides of the Alps throughout the long period from the First Crusade to the twilight of the Middle Ages. In substance, we should investigate the possible presence of Jewish beliefs relating to ritual child murders linked to the feast of Passover, while attempting to reconstitute the significance of any such beliefs. The trial records, particularly the minutely detailed reports relating to the death of little Simon Trent, cannot be dismissed on the assumption that all such records represent simply the specific deformation of beliefs held by the judges who are alleged to have collected detailed but manipulated confessions by means of force and violence to ensure that all such confessions conform to the anti-Jewish theories already in circulation at that time. A careful reading of the trial records in both form and substance recall too many features of the conceptual realities, rituals, liturgical practices, and mental attitudes typical of and exclusive to one distinct particular Jewish world. Features which can in no way be attributed to suggestions on the part of judges or prelates to be ignored. Only a frank analysis of these elements can make any valid new and original contribution to the reconstruction of beliefs relating to child sacrifice held by the alleged Jewish perpetrators themselves, whether real or imagined, in addition to attitudes based on the unshakable faith in their redemption and ultimate vengeance against the Gentiles, emerging from blood and suffering, which can only be understood in the context. In the Jewish Germanic world, in continual movement, the profound currents of popular magic had, over time, distorted the basic framework of Jewish religious law, changing its forms and meanings. It is in these mutations in the Jewish tradition, which are, so to speak, authoritative, that the theological justifications of the, I'm going to butcher this, commemoration in mockery of the Passion of Christ is to be sought, which, in addition to its celebration in the liturgical rite, was also intended to revive in action vengeance against a hated enemy, continually reincarnated throughout the long history of Israel. The Pharaoh, Amalek, Edom, Haman, Jesus. Paradoxically, in this process, which is complex and anything but uniform, elements typical of Christian culture may be observed to rebound, sometimes inverted unconsciously, but constantly within the Jewish beliefs, mutating in turn and assuming new forms and meanings. These beliefs in the end became symbolically abnormal, distorted by a Judaism profoundly permeated by the underlying elements and the characteristic features of an adversarial and detested religion, unintentionally imposed by the same implacable Christian persecutor. We must therefore decide whether or not the alleged confessions relating to the crucifixion of children the evening before Passover, the testimonies relating to the utilization of Christian blood in the celebration of the feast of the Passover, represent in actual fact mere myths, i.e., beliefs and ideologies dating far back in time, or actual ritual practices, i.e., events which actually occurred in reality and were actually celebrated in prescribed and consolidated forms with their more or less fixed baggage or formula and anathemas, accompanying the magical practices and superstitions which formed an integral part of the mentality of the Jews themselves. In any case, I repeat, we should avoid the easy shortcut of considering these trials and testimonies only as projections extorted from the accused by torture and other coercive methods, both psychological and physical, of the stereotypes, superstitions, fears, and the beliefs of the judges and populace. Such a method would trigger a process inevitably leading to the dismissal of these same testimonies as valueless documents with the little basis in reality, except as indications of the obsessions of a Christian society which saw in the Jew merely a distorted mirror image of its own defects. This task appears to have seemed absolutely prohibitive to many scholars, even famous ones, well educated men of goodwill, having concerned themselves with this difficult topic. First, Gavin Lanmuir, who, starting from the facts of Norwich, England, considers the crucifixion and ritual haemophagia, which appears in two different phases of history, as simply the cultivated and interested inventions of ecclesi- oh my gosh, ecclesiastic groups denying the Jews any role at all, except a merely passive one, devoid of responsibility. Lanmer was later followed by Wilhad Paul Eckert, Diego Qualiglone, Wolfgang True, and Roni Pochia-Hsia, who, although examining the phenomenon of ritual child murder from different points of view, intelligently and competently, starting with the late Middle Ages, paying particular attention to the Trent trial documentation, considered it all tout court and often a priority of baseless libel, an expression of hostility on the part of the Christian majority against the Jewish minority. According to the point of view adopted by these researchers, the inquisitors' interrogation methods and tortures serve no purpose other than to orchestrate a completely harmonious confession of guilt, i.e., of adherence to a truth already existing in the minds of the inquisitors. The use of leading questions and a variety of stratagems, including in particular refined torture, were intended to force the defendants to admit that the victims had indeed been kidnapped, tortured according to Jewish ritual, and finally killed in hatred of the Christian faith. The confessions are said to be obviously unbelievable, since the murders were all allegedly committed to permit the ritual use of Christian blood in violation of the biblical prohibition against the ingestion of blood, a prohibition scrupulously observed by all Jews. As to torture, it is best to recall that its use in the municipalities of northern Italy, at least from the beginning of the 13th century, was regulated not only by tractate but by statute as well. As an instrument for determining the truth, torture was permitted in the presence of serious and well justified clues in which it was considered truly necessary by the podesta magistrate and judges. All confessions extorted in this manner to be considered valid had to be corroborated by the inquisitor later under normal conditions, i.e., in the absence of physical pain or even the threat of renewed torture. These procedures, while unacceptable in our eyes today, were therefore in fact normal and seem to have been observed in the case of the Trent trials. Israel Yuval, following the footsteps of Cecil Roth's stimulating pioneering study, is more critical and seems more open-minded. Yuval stresses the link between the blood libel accusations and the phenomenon of the mass suicides and child murders among the German Jewish communities during the First Crusade. The picture which emerges is one of Ashkenazi Jewry's hostile and virulent reaction against the surrounding Christian society, a reaction finding expression not only in liturgical invective, but above all in the conviction that the Jews themselves were capable of compelling God to wreak bloody revenge against their Christian persecutors, thus bringing redemption closer. More recently, Yuval very relevantly demonstrated that the Ashkenazi responses to ritual murder accusations were surprisingly weak. These responses, whenever they were recorded, contained not the slightest rejection of the probative evidence. Rather, they consisted of a mere tu quo of the accusations against Christians. Nor are you yourselves exempt from guilt of ritual cannibalism. Quote, as Yuval wrote, David Malkiel had already noted the manner in which phenomenal prominence was given to the scene, described in his secondary Midrash, even in the illustrations of the Passover Haggadah of the German Jewish communities, of the Pharaoh taking a health-giving bath in the blood of cruelly massacred Jewish children. The message which cast not the slightest doubt upon the magic sorry, the message which cast not the slightest doubt upon the magical therapeutic effectiveness of children's blood seemed intended to turn the accusations around. It is, quote, it is not we Jews, or, if you wish, not just we Jews, who have committed such actions. The enemies of Israel in history have been guilty of these things as well, in which case it was Jewish children who were the innocent victims. End quote. Any showing that these murders celebrated the Passover ritual represented not just myths, i.e., more or less consistently widespread consistent religious beliefs, but rather actual rites pertaining to organized groups and forms of worship which were actually practiced, requires a respect for due methodological prudence. The existence of this phenomena, once it is unequivocally proven, must be viewed within its historical, religious, and social context, not to mention the geographical environment in which it is presumably said to have found expression, with all the related and peculiar characteristics which cannot be replicated elsewhere. In other words, we must attempt to search for the heterogeneous elements and particular historical religious experiences which are alleged to have made the killing of Christian children for ritualistic purposes appear plausible during a certain period within a certain geographical area, i.e., the German speaking regions of Transalpine and Cisalpine Italy and Germany, or whatever there were strong ethnic elements of German Jewish origin, any time between the Middle Ages and the early modern era, as the expression of collective adjustments of Jewish groups, and a presumed desire on the part of God in this sense, or as the irrational instrument of pressure to reinforce that desire on the part of God, as in the mass suicides and child murders for the love of God during the First Crusade. In this research, we should not be surprised to find customs and traditions linked to experiences which did not exist elsewhere, experiences which were to prove more deeply rooted than the standards of religious law itself. Although diametrically opposed in practice, accompanied by all the appropriate and necessary formal and textual justifications, action and reaction, instinctive, visceral, virulent, in which children, innocent and unaware, became the victims of God's love and vengeance. The blood of children bathing in the altars of a God considered to be in need of guidance, sometimes of impatient compulsion, impelling him to protect and to punish. At the same time, we must keep in mind that in the German-speaking Jewish communities, this phenomenon, where it took root, was generally limited to groups in which popular traditions, which had over time distorted, evaded, or replaced the ritual standards of Jewish Halakha, in addition to deeply rooted customs, saturated with magical and alchemical elements, all combined to form a deadly cocktail, which, when mixed with violent and aggressive religious fundamentalism, there can be no doubt, it seems to me, that once the tradition became widespread, the stereotypical image of Jewish ritual child murder continued inevitably to take its own course, out of pure momentum. Thus, the Jews were accused of every child murder, much more often wrongly than rightly, especially if discovered in the springtime. In this sense, Cardinal Lorenzo Ganganelli, later Pope Clement the 14th, was correct in his famous report in both his justifications and his distinctions. The records of the ritual murder trials should be examined with great care and with all due caution in connection with the witchcraft trials. Carlo Ginzburg pointed out that the defendants or victims in a show trial of this type, quote, ended up by losing all sense of their own cultural identity as a result of the acceptance in whole or in part by violence or apparently out of spontaneous free choice of the hostile stereotype imposed by their persecutors, i.e., a sort of medieval Stockholm effect. Anyone who fails to conform by simply repeating the results of these findings of historical violence must seek to work upon the rare cases in which the documentation is not just formally set forth in question and answer form, in which therefore one may find fragments relatively immune from distortions of the culture which the persecution was intent upon blotting out. End quote. The, the Trent trials are a priceless document by. Oh my gosh, I need to drink some water. The Trent trials are a priceless document of this very kind. The trial records, especially the cracks and rifts in the overall structure, permitting the researchers to distinguish and differentiate in substance, not just inform between the information provided by the accused and the stereotypes imposed by the inquisitors, are dazzlingly clear. This fact cannot be glossed over or distorted by means of preliminary categorizations of an ideological or polemic nature intended to invalidate those very distinctions. In many cases, everything the defendants said was incomprehensible to the judges, often because their speech was full of Hebraic ritual and liturgical formula pronounced with a heavy German accent, unique to the German Jewish community, which not even Italian Jews could understand. 12, in other cases, because their speech referred to mental concepts of an ideological nature, totally alien to everything Christian. It is obvious that neither the formula nor the language can be dismissed as merely the astute fabrications and artificial suggestions of the judges in these trials, dismissing them as worthless, as invented out of a whole cloth, as the spontaneous fantasies of defendants terrorized by torture and projected to satisfy the demands of their inquisitors, cannot be imposed as the compulsory starting point, the prerequisite for valid research, least of all for the present paper. Any conclusion of any nature whatsoever must be duly demonstrated after a strict evaluation and verification of all the underlying evidence. Sin ira et studio, using all available sources capable of confirming or invalidating that evidence in a persuasive and cognitive manner. The present paper could not have been written without the advice, criticism, meetings, and discussions with Danny Nissim, a long-time friend who, in addition to his great experience as a bibliographer and bibliophile, made available to me his profound knowledge of the history of the Jewish community, of the Venetia region, and of Padua in particular. The conclusions of this work are nevertheless mine alone, and I have no doubt that the above named persons would very largely disagree with them. I have engaged in lengthy discussions of the chapters of the Jews of Venice with Reine Mueller, over the course of which I was given highly useful suggestions and priceless advice. Thanks are also due to the following persons for their assistance in the retrieval of the archival and literary documentation, for their encouragement and criticisms to Diego Quaglione, Gian Maria Baranini, Rachel Scuro, Miriam Davidi, Elliot Horowitz, Judith Dishon, Boris Kotzlerman, and Ida Dreyfus. Grateful thanks are also due to those of my students who participated actively in my seminars on the topic held at the Department of Jewish History at Bar Ilan University from 2001 through 2002 and 2005 through 2006, during which I presented the provisional results of my research. First and foremost, however, I wish to thank Ugo Berti, who persuaded me to undertake this difficult task, giving me the courage to overcome the many foreseeable obstacles which stood in my way. We'll skip the notes to the preface, and let's just go right into Chapter 1. At Venice with Holy Roman Emperor Friedrich III, 1469. One second. It was in February of 1469 that the Holy Roman Emperor Friedrich III, traveling from Rome, made his solemn entrance at Venice with a long retinue for which was to be his third and last official visit to the city, which he so loved and admired. It was to be his first visit to the city of Venice since his triumphant reception immediately following his coronation as Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope in Rome in 1452. As was customary on these magnificent occasions, Friedrich spent entire days in diplomatic meetings and receiving the official visits of ambassadors and in conferring diplomas, stipends, and privileges of all sorts upon the beneficiaries selected from the long list of names prepared by his officials, as dictated by imperial interests and his own. In those days, intriguers, wheeler-dealers, and adventurers attached to the monarch's court, or who thought they were, toiled with a calculated industriousness to intercede in favor of various persons seeking official ratification of their own professional and economic success, of priests, praticians, and academics bent upon crowning their own cursus honorum through the attainment of some precious imperial investment, or those of variety of ethnic and religious communities intent on achieving confirmation of their ancient or recent privileges, not to mention merchants and intriguers intent on covering up affairs of dubious honesty and scraping up advantages for themselves during the solemn visit. Friedrich was known as a fanatical and often naive collector of relics of all types. It is not therefore surprising that the objectives of his trip to Venice should have included passionate and unrestrained hunt for relics, hawked about in abundance by wheeler-dealers and impertinent intermediaries at high prices, a fact noted with malicious humor by Michel Colli, a salt superintendent, in a report sent from Venice to the Duke of Milan, in which he cast doubt on Friedrich's alleged competence where relics were concerned. According to the Malaysian officials, the emperor, in this type of business, which he presumed to carry out directly and without regard to price, was a sucker to be plucked assiduously, adding to accentuate the ridicule, half seriously, half facetiously, that, quote, certain Greeks sold him dead bones, including the tail of the ass that brought Christ to Bethlehem, end quote. On this occasion, some supposed relics of Saint Vigilius found their way to Venice in the hands of a loving and faithful subject of Friedrich, Giovanni Hinderbach, a famous humanist and a man of the church who had traveled from Trent to the city of the lagoons, not only to present the emperor with the highly valued relics, but above all as an act of gratitude on the occasion of his receipt of his much sought after investiture of the temporality of the episcopate of Trent. Again, it was Colley who informed the Duke of Milan that his illustrious majesty invested the Bishop of Trent with 1,000 temporal solemnities and celebrations. But Hinderbach was not the only person to have undertaken the uncomfortable journey from Trent to Venice during the German Emperor's distinguished presence in the city. One second. Tobias de Magdeburg was an obscure Jewish herb alchemist who, after traveling down from his native Saxony and finding exile among the mountains of the region of Trent, practiced the art of medicine and surgery with some success, at least on the local market. A few years later, he was to meet Hinderbach under much unhappier circumstances, under indictment for the participation in the cruel ritual murder of little Simon, later sainted as Simon of Trent. Imprisoned in the castle of Buonconsiglio and admitting his guilt, he was to meet a cruel death at the stake, accompanied by the confiscation of all of his goods. Maestro Tobias appears to have been acting in accordance with other motives during the emperor's official visit to Venice, particularly the possibility of meeting large groups of German Jews arriving from the other side of the Alps, along with Friedrich's baggage train, many of whom Tobias looked forward to seeing again after years of involuntary separation. There was no shortage of German Jews at Venice in February of 1469. Disciplined, humble, but totally self-absorbed and self-interested. In his depositions before the Judge of Trent in 1475, Tobias was not exaggerating when, after recalling his own presence in the city during his Most Serene Highness's visit to Venice, he stressed that many Jewish merchants, in crossing the Alpine barrier, had actually traveled from the German territories to the city of the lagoons for the purpose of acquiring a wide variety of high-priced goods without paying taxes or duty of any kind, passing them off as goods owned by the emperor, in whose baggage train they were said to have found their way back to Germany. This astute and bold stratagem was well worth the physical and economic cost of the difficult trip to the city of Dogs. But Tobias's presence in Venice was not due to any mere nostalgia for the people among whom he had been born and grew up. As a physician, and as a Jewish physician in particular, he knew that the emperor, during his visit, would, as he was normally accustomed to do, grant doctoral degrees in medicine to a swarm of more or less highly recommended candidates, including a few Jews. In fact, it was during that same February of 1469 that Friedrich granted a license permitting the College of Physicians of San Luca, an institution of higher learning, teaching students of various origins, not just Venetians, to confer the insignia of imperial authority upon 8 medical graduates per year. Enea Silvio Piccolomini, later Pope Pius II, recalled the manner in which Friedrich graduated a swarm of medical students during his second visit to Italy. The number of Jews on the emperor's the number of Jews on the emperor's list of candidates remains unknown, nor do we know who filed the petitions to inscribe these Jewish candidates, or the methods used, or the reasons for doing so. We only know that many Jewish physicians of various origins, in addition to Tobias, a resident of Trent, were in Venice during the emperor's visit, attracted by an opportunity of obtaining some much sought-after title from Emperor Friedrich in person. Nor do we know how many of them had already spent considerable periods of time in the city of the lagoons in search of fame and fortune. Among them were the Jews of Moschrab, Lazaro, and the better-known Omobono, Simcha Bunim or Bunim, keeper of the pharmacy, della Vesgia at San Cassian, with a house at San Stai, only a few steps from the Alberero de Bresciana, Magister Homo Bone Jewish physician at the Spezzaria della Vecchia at San Cassian, with his house near San Stai, not far from the Casa de Bressani at Venice. Accompanying them was the physician Moise de Rodi, whose presence is attested to with certainty in 1473, but who probably arrived in Venice even earlier, and Maestro Theodoro, a Jewish physician who reached Venice in 1469 with Friedrich. The best known of all, however, was without a doubt the rabbi and barber surgeon Jehuda Messer Leon, certainly a product of Ashkenazi Jewish environment in his origins at Monticello in the Vicinitian region are indeed a fact. The same Leon who resided in Venice starting in 1469 at the earliest, where his son David was born, was officially granted his degree in medicine during the emperor's visit, although formally the diploma was only signed a few days later by the imperial notary at Porredone, but still in the month of February. Similarly, years later, in August of 1489, the emperor, still at Pordenone, is said to have granted a doctorate in medicine to two Jewish candidates, both of them from Sicily and belonging to the Zeni family at Palmero, David di Aroni and Salmonone di Mossi. The petitions of the Jews to the emperor, who had always been highly esteemed for his benevolent attitude, filed during his stay in Venice during the winter of 1469, were submitted by an ambassador admitted to Friedrich's presence for that particular occasion. The occasion was described as follows. Early in the 16th century, with some satisfaction, although with undoubted exaggeration, by the chronicler Elia Capicelli, rabbi of Candia, who has studied medicine at the Talmudic Academy of Padua. Quote, the Emperor Friedrich III was very favorable to the Jews during his visit to Venice in 1469, when his vassals and subjects presented him with gastronomic gifts. He never refused to eat them before his servants and functionaries had tasted them first, as is the custom among emperors. Whenever the Jews brought him gifts of this kind, Friedrich never hesitated to eat any of the dishes immediately, saying that he had complete faith in the loyalty and honesty of his Jewish subjects. Quote, later, Friedrich, traveling from Venice, went to Padua to gain an impression of that city. On the occasion, the Serenissima prepared a carriage for him and placed it in the city walls. The horses pulled the carriage, from which the emperor admired the entire city. This was done so that he might easily verify the thickness and solidity of the walls of Padua. Friedrich signed a pact with Venice and remained its faithful ally for the entire time he lived. End quote. In all probability, the ambassadorship of the Jews conferring with Friedrich III, as described by Capsali, was headed by David Mavrogonotto, in Italian Marogonotto, an adventurer and not overly scrupulous businessman in the service of the Republic of Venice, a person of enormous financial resources and great influence, a native of Candia who was often sent on hazardous missions to the land of the Aegean and the Great Turk, where he was to run many risks and die a cruel death. On the other hand, he was certainly capable of procuring sumptuous stipends and profitable privileges for himself. Maestro Tobias de Magdeburg, the humble physician from Trent, had seen Mavrogonto at Venice during the days of the imperial visit. Although he did not know Mavrogonto's name, he had observed Mavrogonto with respect and reverential fear. He knew approximately where he lived, although he did not know the exact address, but he was well aware that he would never have been able to approach Mavrogato without undergoing the suspicious appraisal of Mavrogato's bodyguards. Perhaps Tobias thought that the Mavrogato's recommendation would help him get him to Tobias, including in the list of people enjoying the emperor's favor or those about to receive a doctorate, but he was unable, or did not dare, to ask for it. The personages and appearance of Mavrogato nevertheless remained imprinted in his memory after many years. In 1475, in speaking to the judges at Trent, he envisioned Mavrogato as follows, erroneously imagining that he might still be alive. Quote, he might have been 44 or 45 years old. He wore his hair long and wore a black beard, like the Greeks. He wore a black cloak that came down to his feet and covered his head with a black cap. In substance, he dressed like the Greeks. End quote. But who was David Mavrogato really? An ambiguous and mysterious character. Mavrogato appeared in Venice in 1461 on his own initiative to reveal a conspiracy being hatched on the island of Cadia against the Serenissima. The Council of Ten did not hesitate to take the Jewish merchant into its service and send him back to Cadia on a secret mission to spy on the conspirators and report them to the Venetian authorities after gathering the evidence required for their arrest. Mavrogato carried out the mission to perfection, although his tireless commitment finally ended by blowing his cover, rendering continued residence on his native island impossible, since, as he claimed, both Greeks and Jews pointed him out with their fingers, considering him a vile informer, or Malshin in Jewish judicial terminology, a term with lethal penal implications. We also know that Mossi Capsali, rabbi at Constantinople, had threatened Mavrogato with excommunication at the request of the Jews of Candia. The privileges requested early in his career by Mavrogato in return for services rendered were granted without delay and with expressions of profound gratitude by the Council of Ten in December of 1463. These rights, which extended to his sons Jacob and Elia and his descendants in perpetuity, included, among other things, exemption from the wearing of the distinctive sign required of the Jews, and authorization to move about armed wherever he wished. He was not, however, granted the privilege odd in appearance, but perfectly consistent with the type of persons with whom he had to deal, of striking two names off the list of banned persons wanted by Serenissima for the crime of homicide. Mavrogato, Judeus de Crita et Mercato in Venice, knew full well who might have benefited from such a clause, and had a very definitive ideas about certain people condemned in absentia, who might thus have been permitted to return to the territories under Venetian domination. At this point, the entrepreneurial Jew from Candia, a permanent resident at Venice since the beginning of 1464, traveling frequently and easily, supervising his goods and entering and leaving the port of en route for Cadia and Constantinople, was officially a spy in the service of the Republic and its disposal for other more or less hazardous secret missions. I'm really thirsty today. In effect, Mavrogato is thought to have been sent to Candia and Constantinople at least 4 times in 1465, the next year in 1468, and in 1470 during the First Venetian-Turkish War. It is possible that in 1468, on the eve of Friedrich's imperial visit to Venice, Mavrogato may have accompanied a vessel loaded with goods owned by himself from Cadia to the Venetian landing place in June of 1465. A decree signed by the Council of Ten officially admitted that Mavrogato had been sent to the capital of the Great Turk to spy on the enemy. In 1466, he was referred to the Jew from Crete called David, called upon by Venice to participate in the peace negotiations with the Sultan Mahomet II. David Mavrogato died as mysteriously as he lived, probably during his fourth mission. On December 18th, 1470, the Doge of Venice, writing to the Duke of Crete, mentioned the death of his secret agent, but without providing any details as to the circumstances of his death. Mavrogato may have accepted the dangerous assignment of plotting the Great Turk's assassination in one way or another, and may for some reason have failed in the mission, meeting an unexpected death in the process. Other later clues are also thought to point in that direction. Among the requests filed by Mavrogato with the Council of Ten after his first secret mission to Cadia in the years 1461 through 1462 was that of being permitted to avail himself of a bodyguard assigned to his personal defense. Quote, that you might deign to grant him the privilege of keeping some person near him for the safety of his persons, so that no violence or ignominy may be done to him by some villain or other evil persons. End quote. Once his petition had been accepted by the Venetian legal authorities in February 1464, the merchant from Cadia made haste to appoint a person originally described as a sort of bodyguard, but referred to in the document as Mavrogato's associate, a designation quite distinct in scope as well as quality. This bodyguard, or associate, was to share in almost all the privileges granted by the city of Venice to Mavrogato, including that of being authorized to engage in business of any kind on a basis of equality with Venetian merchants, and being permitted to move about the city in territory wearing the black hat of Christian gentlemen instead of crocus, a colored beret of the Jews. For this reason, Mavrogato in Venice and its domains was known as Mauro Baretti. Mavrogato was an experienced and rich businessman, but not a muscular street fighter or expert in the martial arts. These latter services were to be provided by a man bearing the name of Salomone de' Piovi di Sacco, known throughout Venice and the entire Veneto region as a banker, merchant, and a rough and ready financier, as bold as he was unscrupulous. Starting in 1464 and continuing thereafter, Mavrogato is thought to have entrusted his affairs to Salmone de' Piovi di Sacco. During his enforced and prolonged absences from Venice, including the management of his lordly dwelling at San Cassian, and his joint interest in the commercial ventures undertaken on the maritime routes to the great markets of the Levant. Finally, Mavrogato is also believed to have entrusted Salmone de' Piovi with some of his own precious secrets as a diplomatic spy in the pay of Venice. On the eve of the first risky trip to Constantinople in June 1465, David Mavrogato informed the Council of Ten that he had indeed confirmed Salomone as his business agent at Venice, quote, due to the complete faith which I have in him, end quote. Salmone's ancestors had arrived in Italy in the last part of the 14th century from the Rhine region in Germany, perhaps from the same important seat of the Archbishop of Cologne. The family had gradually extended its offshoots from Cividale del Friuli, where Mauricio and Faes, Salmonelli's father and grandfather respectively, had operated in the local money market, to Padua, where in the mid 15th century the same Salmoni managed the Bank of San Lorenzo in the city district of the same name. Salmonelli and his clan formed part of a migratory flow extending to all the regions of northern Italy since the very late 14th century, including the massive Transalpine migration of entire German speaking communities, both Christians and Jews, from the Rhineland, Bavaria, and Upper and Lower Austria, Franconia, and Alsace. The Carten, Styria, and Thuringia, Slovenia, Bohemia, and Moravia, Silesia, Swabia, and Saxony, Westphalia, Württemberg, and in the Palatine, Brandenburg, Baden, Worms. Wow. Regensburg and Spira, a heterogeneous German-speaking population made up of rich and poor, entrepreneurs and artisans, financiers and scoundrels, men of religion, adventurers, and rascals, traveling from the Transalpine territories via the mountain crossings in a process of long duration towards the lagoons of Venice, as well as the cities and lesser centers of the terra firma of the Veneto region. This was a large-scale phenomenon containing a large Jewish component which had already come to the forte in the regions of northern Italy in consequence to the persecutions following the Black Death in the mid 14th century, as well as sporadically during the centuries before. Ashkenazi, i.e., German Jewish communities of diverse numerical consistency, formed in a myriad of localities, large and small, from Pavia to Cremona, from Bassanova to Treviso, from Cividale to Gorizia and Trieste, from Udine and Pordoni to Conigliano, from Feltri and Vicenza to Reviggio, from Landinario. Oh my gosh, I swear if this keeps going on, I'm just going to end it right here. From Landinara to Badia Polisine, from Padua and Verona to Mestre. Here they stayed, a stone's throw from Venice, an enterprising Jewish community to considerable economic weight, whose members came mostly from Nuremberg and the adjacent areas. In 1382, a few Jews from Mestre obtained authorization to move to Venice to practice money lending, but were expelled in a few years later. In 1397, for failing to comply with the conditions under which the government of Venice had admitted them to the city. One second. The Serenisima thus returned to its traditional policy of refusing to grant permanent residence to Jews on the banks of the Great Canal, except under exceptional circumstances and for periods of short duration. This policy, frequently quite contrary to the actual practice, witnessed Jews crowding the streets of certain city districts during the day and remaining there in great numbers even after dark, lodged in houses and inns, sometimes for long periods of time. There was no shortage of Jews in Venice. mostly physicians, influential merchants, and bankers, having established themselves more or less permanently at Venice. The numerical consistency of this community, heterogeneous in professions but more or less homogeneous in ethnic origin, originating from the Transalpine German speaking territories, has until today been considered from an unjustly simplistic point of view. Beginning in the second half of the 15th century, they tended to gather in one particular strategic area, a sheltered location in the international market of Rialto, the node of the great trading system linking the city of Venice by land and sea to the centers of the plains of the Po River Valley and the German-speaking regions, which constituted a constant point of economic, social, and religious reference, towards which the eyes of these Ashkenazi Jews continued to be directed. These areas included the districts of San Cassian, where a kosher butcher's shop soon opened, preparing meat according to the Jewish custom, St. Agostino, San Polo, and Santa Maria Mater Domini at San Pollo. They probably also attended the German Rite Synagogue, authorized by the Venetian government in 1464 to serve the Jews who reside in the capital or who meet there to carry on their businesses, with a decree which nevertheless limited their liturgical collective meetings to the participation of 10 adults of the male sex. Moreover, the Jewish community at Venice, like the names of more or less distant Ashkenazi origin to be seen in the more immediate and smaller centers of northern Italy, formed part of a German Jewish koine consisting of German speaking Jews on both sides of the Alp, linked by liturgical usages and similar customs, sharing the same history, often marked by events both tragic and invariably mythologicized, as well as by the same attitude of harsh hostility to the arrogant Christianity of surrounding society, the same religious texts of reference, the same rabbinical hierarchies produced by the Ashkenazi Talmudic academics to whose authority they intended to submit, and the same family structures. Those communities, made up by homogeneous entities from the social and religious point of view, which might be called supranational, in which the Jews of Pavia identify themselves with those of Regensburg, the Jews from Treviso from the Jews of Nuremberg, and the Jews of Trent um, with those of Cologne and Prague, but certainly not those of from Rome, Florence, or Bologna. Relations with the Italian Jews, who often lived alongside them, where such relations existed, were markedly fortuitous, based on the contingent common needs of an economic nature and the common perception of being viewed as identical by the surrounding Christian environment. Many of these Ashkenazi Jews did not speak Italian, and if or when they did speak it, it was difficult to understand them due to the heavy German inflection of their pronunciation and the many Germanic and Yiddish terms with which their phrases were crammed packed. Not only the Hebrew language, but the common liturgical usage of German and Italian Jews was pronounced in a radically different way, so that the two groups considered it impossible to pray together. It is therefore surprising that Italian Jews were not on terms of much familiarity with German Jews. Despite their close proximity, the Italian Jews had little knowledge of the German ones, distrusted their aggressive economic audacity, which generally had little respect for the nation's laws, and dissented from their religious orthodoxy, which they considered exaggerated and depressing. Sometimes rightly or wrongly, they feared them. The Italian Jewish coin, i.e., of distant Roman origin, Jews active in the money trade only moved from Rome to seek permanent residence in the municipalities of central and northern Italy, starting in the second half of the 13th century, lived side by side with the German Jewish coin of more recent origin, but without assimilating, without merging, and without being influenced, except to a minor and quite secondary degree. They were distant brothers, even if they were not brothers who hate and fear each other. The first group of Roman Jews, i.e., Jews of Italian origin, flowing into the centers of the plain of the Po from their preceding seats in the Patrimonio of San Pietro in Umbria, in the Marca di Ancona, in the Lazio, and in the Campania to carry on the authorized money trade, i.e., regulated by permits, did not reach these regions simultaneously with the arrival in those regions of the German Transpalpine Jews active in the same profession. They in fact preceded them by several decades. The first Jewish moneylenders in Padua and Lonigo in the Venetian region were Italians and initially settled there between 1360 and 1370. Jews of German origin only reached the region in consistent numbers at a later time at the end of the century, and in particular at the beginning of the 15th century. A comparison of the clauses of the permits granted to the German Jews compared to those granted to the Italian Jews, often active in the same areas, reveals obvious traces of profound differences in the religious usage and mentalities, sediments of particular and diverse historical experiences, the attitudes and ceremonial components, the fears and mistrust, the meaning and dimension of life, the relations with the surrounding Christian society of these German Jews, immersed in the new Italian reality in which they felt profoundly foreign, remained influenced and marked by their experiences in the Germanic world from which they originated, and which they had only left physically. The principal concern of these immigrants seemed to be understandably that of ensuring their physical safety and the protection of their property against the dangers represented by a surrounding society which considered them treacherous and potentially hostile. I might actually finish this whole jug. Where were we? Almost obsessively, the chapters of the permits repeatedly mention the exemplary punishments to be threatened to anyone causing harm or injury to the Jews, or subjecting them to trouble or vexations. The permit granted by the municipality of Venzone to the moneylender Benedetto de Regensburg in 1444 contained the condition that wet nurses and Christian personnel in the service of the Jews were not to be molested or offended, nor could they be made to work on Sunday or the feast days of the Christian calendar. The Transalpine Jews were particularly sensitive to the possibility of being falsely accused and, in consequence of suffering from legal proceedings and expropriations as shown by their preceding experience in the German territories, the scars of which they still bore. In 1414, Salomon de Nuremberg and his companions requested and obtained a concession from the government of Trieste, stating that if Jews were accused of any crime or offense before the judges of that city, they would not be subjected to torture, to extort confessions without at least 4 citizen witnesses trustworthy and of good reputation against them. The permits signed by the municipality of Lombardy and Triveneto with the Ashkenazi Jews were characterized by a constant concern that they be guaranteed the freedom to observe their religious, ritual, and ceremonial standards with zealous scrupulousness. The religious clauses inserted in the chapters were more hailed in this sense than those found in the contemporary permits granted to Jewish moneylenders or of Italian origin, undoubtedly an indication of greater adherence to the observation of religious precepts on the part of the Ashkenazi community than the Italian one. It was significant in this regard that the appearance of the clause relating to the undisturbed provision of kosher meat, i.e., meat butchered according to the ritual law, appears for the first time in the permits granted to German Jews at the end of the 14th century, from Pavia in 1387 to Udine in 1389, from Pordenone in 1399 to Treviso in 1401. Approximately 20 years before this made its initial appearance, certainly in imitation of and under the influence by the Ashkenazi prototype in its permits of the Italian Jews. The religious clauses inserted in the permits of the German Jews include, in addition to the right to supply themselves with kosher meat to observe their festivities freely, the right not to be compelled to violate the standards of Hebraic laws in the exercise of their lending activities, or having to appear in court on Saturday or the feast days of the Hebraic calendar. The same clauses furthermore permitted the safeguarding of other Jewish alimentary norms, such as the supervised preparation of the wine, cheeses, and bread, a clause usually missing from the permits granted to Italian Jews, the right to attend synagogue, to use a piece of land as a cemetery, and to permit Jewish women to take regular baths of purification after the end of their menstrual periods in the city baths on particular days set aside for them. But the most characteristic clause, absolutely generalized in the permits of Jews of German origin, but significantly absent from the permits of the Italian Jews, was that referring to protection against forced conversions to Christianity. In particular, the Ashkenazi appeared obsessed with the possibility that their children might be kidnapped, subjugated, or subjected to violence, or swindled with snares and tricks to drag them to the baptismal font. That this possibility was anything but remote seemed obvious to anyone having experienced this type of traumatic experience at first hand on the banks of the Rhine or the Main. Permits issued in Friuli, Lombardy, and Veneto, granted to German moneylenders as early as the end of the 14th century, explicitly prohibited friars and priests of any order from proselytizing among Jewish children not yet having reached their 13th birthday. In 1403, Ulrich III, Bishop of Bressani, granted the Jews of the Tyrol protection from any possible ecclesiastical claims to a right of forced conversion of Jewish children. This protection could and did include the dangers represented by baptized Jews, zealous and implicable in plotting the ruin of the Jewish communities from which they originated. In 1395, Mina de Ayedel Bach, representing the Jewish families of German origin residing in Gemona, first stopping place on the main road to the lagoons of Venice after the mountain crossing of Tarvisio, obtained in the initial clauses of their permits explicit provision for the immediate removal from the city of so-called, quote, Jews turned Christian, unquote, who were said to constitute elements of scandal and disturbance. The die was already cast between the Italian and German Jews, settled in the lands beyond the River Po by the mid-15th century, with a few exceptions. The Piazza was henceforth solidly in the hands of Yiddish-speaking Jews who, in the best of cases, spoke badly mangled Italian. In former times, they had crossed the Alps fearfully and almost on tiptoe in search of sufficiently modest and desirable dwellings so as to live and survive comfortably, but they also, when need arose, proved themselves enterprising in financial matters, courageous and even bold in their commercial undertakings, nonchalant and often arrogant and impudent in their relations with the government. only obeying the laws when it was strictly necessary or too dangerous to do otherwise. Victory was now theirs, and it was because of the same bankers and merchants that many of them had been able to accumulate huge sums of capital in a relatively short lapse of time, such as to bear no comparison with the fortunes possessed by Christian mercantile families and uh, patricians who were both more distinguished and of higher rank. The chronology is relatively precise. In 1455, all Italian Jews active in the money trade were expelled from Padua and compelled to shut down their banks, while the Teutonic Jews, divided from and now entirely separated from the Italian Jews, gained the upper hand in the local money market. The most important in the terra firma of the Veneto region, as the early as 10 years before, at Verona, all lending banks owned by Italian Jews had already been closed in 1447, while in 1445 the permits of the Jewish bankers of Vicenza were not renewed. With the Italian Jewish banks shut down in all the principal centers of the Veneto region, a few district lending banks, few in number, but of great economic potential, particularly between the higher interest rates charged by them in the comparison to the rates formerly charged by the banks controlled Italian Jews, remained open to serve the needs of their clientele in the cities and in the countryside. These were the banks of Soavi and Villafranca in the district of Verona, Mestre for Venice, and Este Compasamo Piero, and above all, Piove di Sanco in the Padua district. The forced and almost simultaneous dismantling of the Jewish banks of Padua, Verona, and Vicenza led as an immediate consequence to the almost total extinction of the Hebraic community of Roman origin, which was compelled for the most part to flow into the centers of the nearer side of the Po. On the other hand, however, it allowed other moneylenders from Treviso and the territories of Frulia, who took over the assets and management of the few remaining lending banks, to make extraordinary fortunes. As we have seen, these banks benefited from an extremely broad catchment area and could rely on a numerous and heterogeneous clientele. Their economic success was therefore guaranteed and proved to be exceptional in scope. The lucky few bankers remaining on the piazza were almost all Ashkenazi, the same Jews who had hastened or more or less directly procured the financial ruin of the Italian Jews. The most prominent among them was, in the end, Salomone de Macrosio, owner of the Banco de Piove di Sanco, and after 1464, David Mavroco de Candia's official business associate with a more or less official residence at Venice. Rich and influential Salmonone, although not a man of great culture, was not averse to sponsorship ventures, in which fields he established himself with flair and good taste. At Piove, where the local community was practically one of his fiefdoms in 1465, he became associated with the German printer Meshulam Kusi, whose presence at Padua is attested to in the same year. Kusi undertook the initial printing of one of the first Hebraic cunabulae, certainly one of the most important and monumental at Piove, towards the end of 1473. This was a classic ritualistic code, Arba a Turum, a work of German Rabbi Yaakov B. whose family originated from the Cologne, but had carried on its captivities for the most part at Barcelona in Catanoli, and later at Toledo in Castile. The 4 volumes, printed on Cusi's presses with great care and heedless of cost, were completed in July 1475 and constituted one of the most splendid and elegant examples of Hebraic printing. Certain copies of great beauty were printed on parchment and intended for a highly sophisticated readership. Particularly from the economic point of view, one of the most important of whom was to be Salomone de' Piovi. The printing costs linked to the supplies of machinery, type, materials, and labor were to fluctuate between 700 and 1,000 ducats, a large sum which Cusi might not have had available without the direct or indirect joint involvement of the Jewish banker de' Piovi. We believe that consideration should be given to the possibility that Salomone may have also undertaken another artistic literary undertaking of great importance at proportional economic cost. The precious miniatures of the so-called Rothschild Miscellany, one of the most sumptuous and famous of all Jewish legal codes, were executed in the decade between 1470 and 1480, probably in Leonardo de Bellisci's workshop at Venice. The artistic decoration of the manuscript cost almost 1,000 ducats, a sum equivalent to half the taxes paid by the entire Jewish community of the Duchy of Milan during the same period. Salmone may have been the only Jewish sponsor living more or less permanently in the city of the lagoons, able to make an investment of such magnitude without difficulty. For purposes of comparison, we know that in 1473, Salmone, still active on the Piazza of Venice, together with one of his sons, Marcusio, his firstborn, was able to pay a gigantic sum equal to 300 ducats in cash and another 360 in credits, intended for the restoration of the perimeter wall of the old arsenal. Between 1468 and 1469, in view of Emperor Friedrich's forthcoming visit to Venice, Salmonone hosted a plenary meeting at Piovi of the German rabbis of the Jewish community of northern Italy, presided over by their most authoritative exponent, the jurist Joseph Cologne, then active in the community of Mestre. The petition said to have been presented by the Jewish ambassadorship to the solemn and magnificent emperor during the anticipated audience described by Rabbi Eli Capsali de Candia in his chronicles may have been drawn up on that occasion. During the summer of 1470, David Mavrogato set sail from Venice to return to Candia for what was to be his last mission. He had long since prudently avoided reappearing on his native island. He was probably accompanied on his voyage by Salmonone himself, who at the end of June left his son Salamoncio with a power of attorney for the purpose of collecting a huge loan from the bank Soranzo at Venice, a transaction which he would normally have conducted directly, as we know. This was a voyage from which Mavrogato is thought never to have returned alive, meeting with his tragic demise a few weeks later, certainly before September of that year. From that time onwards, Mavrogato's name and memory were to be systematically omitted from all documents signed by his former associate. Salmonone, as well as Salomon's son, although reference to the privileges obtained by the influential merchant from Candia appears to have become an established custom. This is not surprising and cannot be merely accidental. Salmonone certainly knew the truth about that last voyage to Constantinople in which Mavrogato is believed to have met with unexpected death. Did Salmonon know too much? Did he wish to forget, or rather cause others to forget, that he had been with him on the tragic maritime voyage? What is certain is that Salmonon de Piovi was close to David Mavrogato until the end, perhaps too close. It is not therefore surprising to learn that around that same time Salmonon personally took over a bold project, perhaps planned beforehand by his associate and collaborator from Cadia, quote, to take the life of the great Turk, unquote, thus doing the government of Venice a great favor, to provide for the assassination of Mahomet II. The nonchalant financier informed the Council of Ten that he had sent a Jewish doctor named Valco, whose Italian name was probably derived from the well-known family of doctors, natives of Worms, called Wallach, or Welbusch, to Constantinople at his expense. Quote, Salmonon, as appeared in the books of your Majesties of the Council of Ten, due to his wish to do a great ourselves and all of Christianity a great service by attempting to take the life of the great Turk, chose, at his expense, to send for a Maestro Valco, a Jewish doctor, whom he sent with his own money, unquote. Even before that, we know that the Venetian authorities had been glad to avail themselves of the service of a Jewish barber surgeon, Jacob de Gieta, the Sultan's personal physician, an expert spy and double agent, greedy for gain and treacherous, with whom Mavrogato had maintained frequent contacts. It also appears that Maestro Jacob had reached Venice in secrecy together with Gaeta on the same vessel from Ragusa in the very late 1468, on the eve of the imperial visit and the Venetian Congress of Jewish Physicians held on that occasion. Maestro Valco, paid by Salmonon, moved to Constantinople and went quickly to work, but apparently with little result. Mahomet II was still alive and kicking when the Jewish banker from Piovi finally died, between the end of 1475 and the very early part of the following year. But Salmonon was occupied with certain other matters, much more serious and more disagreeable than merely, quote, taking the life of the great Turk, unquote. During that period, was to prove fraught with danger for all the Jewish communities of northern Italy. The Trent trials of the Jews accused of Little Simon's martyrdom had ended with the condemnation and execution of the principal defendants, who were burnt at the stake or decapitated in June of 1475. Other defendants, including the women of the small community, were waiting to learn their final fate, after which the trial proceedings were suspended in April by order of Sigismundo IV, Count of Tyrol, and were then newly interrupted the following July by order of Pope Sixtus IV, after a brief recommencement requested by several parties for purposes of intervening in the affair. The Pope then personally sent a special commissioner to Trent, the Dominican Battista de Guidici, Bishop of Ventimiglia, with the task of investigating and reporting of the facts. De Guidici, I can never pronounce these. De Guidici, who had initially taken up lodgings at the Trent, later moved to the nearby but more secure seat of Rovereto in territory belonging to Venice, where they met the lawyers, all the top-rate importance whom the Jews of Padua had decided to make available to the defendants. Salmonon played a prominent role in the affair, requesting the Pope to appoint an apostolic inquisitor and probably meeting Battista de Guidici at Padua on Guidici's way to Trent. In accordance with De Guici, with whom he maintained intense epistolary relations, as well as through another Jew from Piovi, belonging to the Cusi family of typographers, having strategically moved to Rovereto, Salmonoli Salmononi provided a safe conduct to a Paduan Jew, a native of Regensburg, and sent him to Innsbruck with the mission of pleading the cause of the Trent defendants still in prison before Sigismundo, Count of Tyrol, and, if possible, of obtaining their release. Salamuni Furstengar, his agent on this delicate mission, was an unscrupulous intriguer who camouflaged himself by dressing not as a Jew, but in the German style, with a short overcoat and a cap on his head, returned from Tyrol, disappointed and empty-handed. His bitter failure was also an indication of the failure of the efforts of the German origin Jewish communities from Veneto region to avoid the tragic consequences of the Trent affair for the defendants who were still alive. Salmononi is said to have died shortly afterwards. The leadership of this conspicuous group committed, as always, to avoiding the political and financial effects and repercussions of the Trent trials on their Jewish brethren, thus passed into the hands of Mano the Aberlino of Vincenza, maximum exponent of the influential Ashkenazim community of Pavia. A prestigious banker with vast financial resources, he had been appointed collector of Jewish taxes to the Lombard communities by the Duke of Milan in 1469. Mano was related to Salmonoli, whose firstborn son, Marcusio, had married one of the brother Angelo's daughters. Mano was to meet Salmonoli at fairly frequent intervals at Venice, where he had more or less officially opened a money-lending shop of secondary importance compared to the great bank of Padua, but still of strategic importance. When Salmonoli, first under, just recovering from the setbacks of Innsbruck, thirsting for revenge or just to reshuffle the cards, took to considering murdering the captain of the guards of the Podesta of Trent and even Bishop Hinterbach himself, hiring an assassin for the task, a person above suspicion, a priest named Paola de Navarra. The industrious Mano offered to finance the bold initiative without regard to cost. Mano asked the priest, Paola, who was probably contacted through his brother Bartolomeo, a druggist at Piovo de Sacco, to poison the persons responsible for the Trent trial and to obtain the arsenic required to do so from the Venetian physician Bunim, owner of the Dea Vecchia pharmacy at San Cassian, who was also believed to have been issued instructions on how to use the arsenic. As a reward, Paolo was to receive 400 ducats, half of it immediately, and the other 200 to be withdrawn over the counter at Mano's bank at Venice. But the conspiracy, the most prominent members of which were all Jews from Pavia, Padua, Novario, Sonicio, Parma, Piaci, oh my gosh, this sucks. I can't pronounce these. Piacenza, Modena, Brescia, Bassano, Roberto, Riva, and Venice failed miserably with the arrest and confession of the fanciful and avaricious priest. And we're going to skip the notes on chapter 1. a lot of notes. All right, and then we will continue with chapter 2 at a later time because my throat. Wow. All right. That's it. Take care.